Everybody. I am here with a very fun guest today. We are going to talk to you about findom. So get excited for that. Before we get into the topic, let me introduce her. So Dr. Kate Balestrieri is a licensed psychologist, certified sex therapist, and certified sex addiction therapist, pact therapist, and founder of Modern Intimacy, which is a group therapy practice in Los Angeles, Miami, New York City, Denver, and Chicago. She's the host of the Get Naked with Dr. Kate podcast, and you can follow her on TikTok and Instagram at Dr. Kate Balestrieri. And we will put the link to that in the show notes so you don't get the spelling wrong, everyone. But welcome, Kate. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm really excited that we were connected and can talk about this pretty fun topic.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me on your show. I'm excited to talk with you about this as well. I think it's probably the one of the most asked about kinks that I get.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start by just telling people, like, what is findom? Like, what does it stand for? What's the definition of it? And what can I go from there?
So financial domination is where somebody gets dominated in the realm of their finances. So this is different than pay to play, different kinds of BDSM that folks might engage in. This is about really being controlled and dominated financially. So a findom will tell you what to buy them in some cases, and will give you lists of things that you can pay tribute to. And you will buy those gifts or send that dollar amount or that gift card. And being controlled in that way is where the arousal takes heed.
Okay, cool. So that makes some sense. And I'm excited to learn more about this because I kind of get the general concept, but of course I'm curious about the deeper psychological aspects behind everything. So with the pay to play, how would you say that's kind of different? Or like, how would you define that as opposed to findom?
So when I say pay to play, usually I'm talking about some sort of transactional experience with a sex worker. Mm-hmm. And that may or may not involve a kink, but it's different than financial domination in the sense that the erotic charge is not to paying someone necessarily, or being told how to pay or what to pay and or what kinds of gifts to tribute. So
that makes sense.
The erotic energy is really around being controlled financially. And I think this is where a lot of the controversy around financial domination comes in too, because when we talk about sex and money, that's where people feel the most vulnerable in life.
It's true. Like, I sometimes think the only other topic people are less comfortable talking about than sex is sometimes money. So now we're even like merging the two. So I hope everyone listening can hang in there if you're uncomfortable, but just, notice it if you are. Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing is like, it's whether or not the financial part is centered in the experience. So like, if it just happens to be a transactional sexual experience with, an escort, a sex worker, even if it's a dominatrix, the financial aspect isn't the kink in sort of a pay to play scenario. Whereas with findom, it's all about that. And like, how do you feel with that exchange of money?
Yes. And around being, out of being powerless, being out of control, surrendering to someone else, taking over the financial decisions in your life. So on kind of a small, low risk scale, this can look like a findom having a list of gifts or items that you can buy for them to pay tribute as their pay pig, which is what financial domination subs are often referred to. Excuse me. But on a bigger scale, sometimes financial dominatrices will have access to people's bank accounts or will tell them how to spend big chunks of money, big swaths of money, including things like how to direct their 401k or cashing out parts of their retirement account or their children's college funds. I've seen a lot of folks really go big in the level of risk and the level of surrender financially that they're willing to go to for this erotic hit. Now, that's not every case. Most of the cases that we hear about or see online are kind of the smaller smaller situations or lower risk, lower impact situations. But for some people, it's not exciting until it is all consuming in their lives.
My God. So, I mean, immediately, this is like the therapist in me. It's like my mind goes to, okay, so like at what point is this healthy? And at what point is this not healthy for people? Like how, if this is something that someone listening is like, ooh, this is sort of like titillating, or I am curious about this. Like, how do you know when it's healthy or not? On either side of it, I guess.
Yeah, this is, I think, the biggest question that comes up around financial domination, especially when people start to say, well, that's unethical, because it goes against its financial exploitation. But it's not, because the parameters are mutually agreed upon. And just as they would be with any other kink or BDSM context, you have safe words, you have stopgaps and measures that you can take to say this is the line and I can't go beyond this. So where I think it can get really dicey is when people are using family money, family allocated money, or partner allocated money, and their partner has not consented. Now that doesn't make it financially unethical, or doesn't make it unethical for the dominatrix, the findom, to engage with them. That's a relationship betrayal, a financial betrayal on behalf of the person who is engaging in the kink. It might be an emotional or a sexual betrayal too.
Right.
But that's not unethical on the part of the findom. It would be unethical on the part of the person engaging in that behavior if they're not sourcing those funds with the consent of a partner or whomever the funds are allocated toward to help.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's kind of like if it gets to a point where, it's impacting your relationships or, like your kid, like when you said the kids' college fund, I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like I felt uncomfortable with that one, but yeah, it is really fascinating. Like where do you draw that line? So I'm just super curious about this one. I'm sure everyone listening is also curious. So one of my thoughts is, regardless of what the kink is, to negotiate those boundaries when you're not sort of like intoxicated or like in the submissive role, is that something that you advise for people too, if they're exploring
Absolutely.
this?
Absolutely. Like with any other kink, I think it's really important that before you get into any play and you're in that space of dopamine and all the fun neurococktail chemicals that are in there, in the heat of the moment, yeah, it's important to really think about what are your limits when you're in a clear-headed state. What allows you to feel really excited, engaged, aroused, but also protects your ability to be a functioning human financially and doesn't deplete the thresholds that you've set for yourself in terms of what makes sense. And definitely, if you are someone who shares expenses or is building family wealth or family goals, really consulting the other people who are impacted by that is important. I'm not suggesting that you should ask your children how much to spend in your findom hobby over the weekend, but if you're saving with a partner or you're sharing expenses on caring for your parents with your siblings or something, you don't want to deplete the funds that are allocated for those kinds of expenses. But it is really important to note that this is a kink that really takes shape and form for folks who feel a high level of financial responsibility. And herein lies where the charge is of surrendering to being under the control of someone else's financial direction. So it's important that those negotiations happen when you are in a clear-headed space and when you can sort of separate yourself from the play to make sure that it does feel aligned with your values when you're not in the heat of the moment.
Yeah. So one of the other things, since we're also focusing on like the arousal is kind of in the financial piece of it, like what's the sexual component? Because I could see people being like, okay, so isn't this just financial manipulation? Like where's the sexual part?
So the sexual part for a lot of folks who engage in this is for the pay pig or the sub is really around the way in which they tie the idea of that financial responsibility or the idea of money and power to their usually conception of gender and their sexual prowess, also tied to their conception of gender.
Interesting.
So, for a lot of folks who engage in this kind of kink, I would say primarily it's men who are the pay pigs and women who are the findoms. Now, it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean that the opposite can't be true, but that's primarily how this plays out. And a big part of that is because in Western cultures, men are primarily socialized to be the breadwinners. They're socialized to experience their masculinity and their sexual virility based on how much money they make and how well they provide for the people with whom they are in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So the sexual charge is kind of like I'm giving in, I'm surrendering in this. You have control over me, much in the same way that um, engaging in kink with a dom, but without a financial component, can also tie into that gender role flipping, right? I'm going to flip the
Totally.
script and be really submissive or completely powerless here. And even humiliated in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where the power is. It gives the men who participate in this, access to different kinds of feelings around money and sexuality and power that maybe they just don't have the ability to have access to in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up so many good points here. And this is part of why I love kink in general because there is something so like subversive about it. It's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
all of these societal agreements of this is how you're supposed to be and this is what's accepted and this is what's appropriate and you know and then sort of like let's turn that on its head and like derive pleasure from turning it on its head. And I think that messing with sort of traditional gender roles in a number of ways can be kind of explored as a kink. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm also wondering now because I've looked on some message boards for findom, and how do you distinguish, especially if you're someone who's like, okay, cool, like I'm a pretty financially successful guy, this is a really interesting idea to me. I think there's a lot of people out there who are like, cool, yeah, give me your money. And maybe there's not even a sexual charge, but they're like, I don't care if you're looking to give away some money, I'll take some. So how do you find someone who's sort of a true findom and understands that dynamic? Like what should people be looking for?
It's a great question. I think the lines are really blurry because there are a lot of women who don't have the sexual charge around the money piece, but definitely are engaging in findom because it is a way that they can make money without necessarily needing to be sexual with someone that they're playing with. Because
Okay.
most findoms do not have sex with their pay pig.
Mm.
Many don't even meet them in person. It's
Mm-hmm.
really a kink that's organized around this financial play. And for many of the pay pigs who engage in it, it's tied again to that humiliation. And so if there's sex play, they may engage with it um, virtually with the
Mm-hmm.
findom, or they may do it on their own time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so for a lot of women, this is a safer way to get into a space from a kink perspective that does allow them to earn extra money, but
Mm-hmm.
also to give them a sense of power over money. And that is something that a lot of women really want and struggle to have experienced in their lives because of the financial subjugation that has existed for women for centuries and centuries and centuries.
Yeah.
And only in recent decades have women started to have access to more financial independence. So, for
Mm-hmm.
a lot of women, the arousal may or may not be to the financial piece, but there may be an empowerment piece that comes up around being able to have money be the source of control and power and
Yeah.
humiliation and excitement.
Right. That totally makes sense. So maybe it doesn't even have to be that there's the sexual arousal on the side of the findom. It's really more so about being on the side of the pay pig.
I think so, but I think there is an indirect arousal to money for the findom, even if it's not a direct, because what does it do for her? Probably makes her feel very powerful or gives her a greater sense of security if she's doing it as an income, right? There are different ways that holistically that can increase a sense of excitement.
That makes sense. So I guess I'm kind of curious, and you started to get into this a little bit, like, is the findom typically sexual? Is there something expected in terms of like, hey, you're giving me this all this money, and and the pay pig's like, well, I'm only going to do that if you do X, Y, Z, or is it kind of like, no, it's really just about the financial exchange, and there doesn't need to be sexy pictures or online, sexting or video acts that are sexual. It's just really almost just like money and some texting.
It really varies, right?
Okay.
Kink, one of the things that I love so much about kink is that it's not a cookie cutter, square peg, square hole kind of situation, right? There's a lot of blurred lines in kink and when I say blurred lines, I mean there's a lot of overlap in what can turn people on. So for some people, it might be really exclusively about the money, and there might not be many sexual images exchanged. There might be a co-occurring humiliation kink that goes along with being financially controlled or degraded. And so it's not really about seeing sexy images of the findom or having her want to play even in a sexual way. It really could be about submitting financially to this person and engaging in that kind of exchange.
Okay.
For other folks, there might be more of an overlap with needing some erotic imagery or needing to see some of that power exhibited in a visual way.
Oh, that's kind of interesting. So it's not even so much like the findom then kind of owe this person something. It's more of them exhibiting the power. That does seem like a very different dynamic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know that a dom ever owes a sub, right, in that way, if we think about it, right?
Right, so, except for like respectful negotiations, that's about it.
Of course,
Yeah.
and attunement and those kinds of things. But a sub, whether we're talking about a financial domination sub or somebody who's engaging in different kinds of bottom play, it's not that kind of quid pro quo exchange. See, that's more of that transactional pay to play.
Right.
But the findom, a way to think about it is that they're usually receiving some sort of devotion or tribute or worship in some way. So, they're doing more of the receiving, and what they give to the pay pig in response is the control over their money or the humiliation or that experience of being in devotion, right?
That makes sense. Sort of the worship aspect or the admiration of power.
Yeah.
Absolutely can be a turn on for a lot of people. So where would someone go to explore this if they're kind of like, ooh, I'm intrigued? what are some sort of places to start or tips you'd have for them?
Yeah, there are folks who will announce that this is what they're into on apps like Field. There are some findoms who have their own websites, and
interesting.
Some who maybe are on the OF platform. There are some that talk about it on apps like TikTok or even on what was formerly called Twitter, so X now.
So weird. Yeah.
That's a separate conversation.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, so people just put it out there on social media sometimes.
They do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've mostly seen it on FetLife in some groups that are, like findom groups. And it sometimes does just seem like the quote unquote doms are just like clamoring for money sometimes. And like they're often the ones kind of posting. And so I think that's part of what's confused the dynamic for me a little bit too, is because it doesn't seem very powerful. And so I was like, okay, like what does this look like when done a little bit better?
Well, that brings up your point from before, right? How do you
Yeah.
discern who's a true dom and who's
Right.
maybe entering into kind of a sex work light in,
Mm-hmm.
experience, but this is a safer way to do that. And there
Right.
definitely are a lot of women who do find this a safer entry point into that kind of transactional experience. So it may not be the kind of power and charge that somebody's looking for, but it might also be the right fit for somebody who also feels a little apprehensive about getting really involved. And so this could be kind of a lower stakes way of learning how it feels for somebody on both sides of the
Hmm.
equation.
That makes sense. So I know you said this is one of the kinks that kind of most intrigues you or that you find kind of most interesting. What do you think it is that you're like, okay, yeah, this one's cool?
For me, it really is about flipping those gender scripts. And
Yeah.
I really champion when people are willing to say unconsciously or consciously to themselves, I want to do something subversive. Because to
Mm-hmm.
me, that's about understanding that you're very polarized in your
Mm.
gender identity or gender expression in some way, or the responsibilities that come with how society puts that on you and
Mm-hmm.
the fears or the guilt or the shame that might come with stepping away and having a different experience of your own gender. So when people play in that space, in a mutually agreed upon, a mutually negotiated consensual kink space, I think, wow, how brave, how bold, how exciting that they are giving themselves permission to feel something really different than what they feel they have access to in their real
Mm.
lives. And to me, that's the whole point of sex and especially kink, is to play in the fantasy and
Mm-hmm.
really, of course, have pleasure, but also it's just a different way to learn about ourselves and
Yeah.
learn about how we want to feel, who we want to be, and to stretch the possibilities of that knowledge.
I love that. And I think the way you're presenting that to me, it's like, it sounds like it could be healing for people. Like, do you find that people feel healed by that?
I do. I do. I really think that there's some counterbalance when we look at what we get out of kink. And many people are drawn to kink without having any trauma in their lives that directs them there. But
Mm-hmm.
for some people who do have trauma in their lives, kink and specifically the care, the communication, the attunement, the negotiation, the boundaries, the safety of kink
Mm-hmm.
can be an incredibly reparative experience. They may or may not
Yeah.
be seeking that out, but they often find it and talk about how much they've learned about themselves, how much they trust themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and a partner who is a safe enough partner. Um, it can be really, really healing. I would say if you're going to engage in findom and you are in a partnership, this
Mm.
definitely can very quickly um, become a multiple betrayal if your partner's not aware that this is exciting for you. I've
Mm-hmm.
worked with so many couples where there's been this financial betrayal on top of the sexual and emotional
Yeah.
betrayal. And a lot of folks don't necessarily couple all of those kinds of betrayal together because for them it's exciting and they want to engage in this play, and that's fine. I get that. And most of the time, partners understand it. I shouldn't say most of the time. Often, partners will understand it conceptually, but when you don't talk with your partners ahead of time about how much money you can allocate toward this and set a budget for yourself, if your partner understands and you guys have those fidelity agreements that you can have things outside of each other in terms of how you play. Um, if partners don't consent to that ahead of time, they often feel incredibly unsafe and it can very
Okay.
quickly escalate relationships ending. So
Okay.
it's something to really think about because it just upends so much security when somebody hasn't said yes to their money being included in how this plays out. And I don't just mean the money that they earn, but the money they think they are sharing with you in a build
Mm-hmm.
towards something financially.
Mm-hmm.
So super important to talk with your partner ahead of time and make sure that you're on the same page.
I can see that. And I mean, certainly like it hasn't been exactly findom, but I've had clients where they're patrons of, cam girls or other kind of sex workers. And there is sort of that double guilt of like, I'm doing something sexual that is somewhat interactive with someone else. And I'm spending, $500 a month that my wife doesn't know about,
Right.
So for sure. I can see that. And sometimes that financial piece it even produces more guilt or more distress than the sexual piece of it. So that makes sense. The other question I have is sort of maybe more just logistical. Like, how do people exchange money, and how do you exchange money in a safe way, especially if maybe you're not wanting to, reveal your identity and have it like posted to your Venmo or something?
Yeah, it's a great question. People are super creative about that, but a lot of people do use Venmo, and
Really?
or
Interesting.
they'll you'd be surprised on how many people will pay directly from their bank account. We have to remember that there is something about being controlled financially, and so the risk of identity and the risk of someone having that information can amplify some of the sexual interest and erotic charge around that. So you would think that more people take extra steps to keep their identity protected, but many don't. No. That's part of the thrill.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, like hearing you say that makes me think that so much of this is actually about vulnerability and maybe just an unexpected way. It's like,
absolutely.
Yeah, you're trusting someone with some pretty major personal details.
Yeah. But a lot of how folks do it, a lot of the findoms will create an Amazon wish list, for example. So someone can go, that protects both parties. Someone can go to their Amazon wish list and buy whatever items they'd like to buy for tribute to the findom. And then the findom's address is more safe. They can choose a P.O. box instead of having it go to their home.
Okay.
And also the pay pigs information is kept protected. So for a lot of folks, that's a safer entry point.
Okay. How do you develop intimacy in this types of relationship? Like, I'm curious what you see in terms of, do people really get to know each other, or is there almost some excitement in the risk and the anonymity?
It's both. It really depends on each person, right? Some folks do want more of that connection and that intimacy, and they will develop a longer term relationship with a findom. And that can look like communicating over a platform, whether it's FetLife or Field, or even Tumblr. I think there are a lot of forums there. Or there's more of a parasocial dynamic, like with OnlyFans or with some of the content creators who might use other platforms to engage with pay pigs. But a lot of it is not super intimate in that way. It's more of a briefer interaction.
Okay.
But, some people will exchange their phone numbers and use text message exchange or Snapchat, things like that. So they do connect with each other. It really, again, depends on the level of risk that each person is willing to engage in. And there have been some really unfortunate outcomes for folks who have engaged in this behavior. There's a really interesting and unfortunate case where a man paid tribute to a woman by buying her, I believe it was a fireplace, one of those portable fireplaces. Very
specific and interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And she didn't have her address on lock, and or he was able to figure out where it was delivered. I'm not exactly sure. Okay. The onus is on him and the accountability is on him. I'm not victim blaming at all. He somehow found her home and decided he wanted more of a relationship with her, and broke into her home and was living in her home unbeknownst to her. He was living in her attic for a period of time.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and would take videos of her at night without her consent. He even
Oh
stole
my
some of her
God.
underwear, but he was arrested and the case was recently heard. So, I mean, it is
Wow.
not, it is important to keep yourself safe until you know you can
Yeah.
trust someone.
That's a really good point. Yeah. And it's interesting talking on this. I definitely feel like I am more on the conservative side of like, let's put in all the precautions and how can they know like no information about you? But I can
Yeah.
also see when there's, you know, maybe a sense of trust builds up over time that, you know, people gradually reveal more like they would in any relationship, really.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I probably wouldn't recommend starting with like sharing your
Yeah.
home address or bank info. But yeah, it is really fascinating. So I appreciate you just kind of sharing all of this with me and with the audience. And yeah, so I guess if people are curious about this, my other question would be if I can see people kind of being like, okay, cool. This sounds interesting. You know, I can go on social media. I can go on, you know, Field or OnlyFans or FetLife. Um, you know, is there sort of like a first step that, you know, you recommend or, what would sort of be like the beginner dip your toe in version from either side?
Well, if you're going to be a findom, what I think is a really smart place to start is
Mm-hmm.
actually to try and connect with someone who is a findom, to
Oh,
have them work with you as a mentor. And of course, you're going to pay tribute to them. No one works for free.
okay. This is a great
But
point.
yeah, but I think it's really important to have a mentor in this space who can teach you about safety, who can teach you
Mm-hmm.
about boundaries, who can teach you about some of the different intimacy needs that different pay pigs will have, and
Yeah.
how and help you craft how you want to address those different needs, because there are differences in how each sub or each bottom, each pay pig will want to engage with you.
Mm-hmm.
So, learning to think about your own limits, your own interests, and crafting that persona as a findom is
Yeah.
important. So, there are many who will work with you if you can, take them on as a bit of a coach or a mentor or a
Okay.
consultant and help train you. And I think that's really smart, especially because for a lot of folks, the well, let me say that a different way. For some of the men who want to play in this space, there can be a tremendous amount of shame or fear,
Hmm.
especially if they think their partner might find out about it and they don't have agreements around this with their partner.
Right.
So, what can happen and what can increase the risk of unsafety for findoms is that somebody can engage in this behavior and then have a lot of remorse or fear around it and then want their money
Hmm.
back or want to kind of
Oh,
undo the scenario, or they might claim that now they've been exploited, right, when in fact it was consensual play.
okay.
So it is really important from a safety perspective, if you're going to go into this space, to really be clear on your agreements and to have some safety precautions in place. So getting a
Right.
mentor is where I would start.
Okay, that's a really good point. And I think that's something that's underutilized in sex and kink in general. I think there's always this idea that, like, well, you're just supposed to know, or you're just supposed to be good at something right away, you know? And it's like, I just think that can do so much harm. So just to kind of have a little bit of, you know, beginner's mind, like it's, you know,
Mhm.
cool. This is a fun new thing to explore. Find someone who can be your mentor or teacher, be willing to compensate them for that. Um, and I actually don't think it would be too hard to find a mentor. Like you can tell who's doing pretty well.
You can.
Yeah,
You
like if
can.
you're looking, you'll figure it out. That's really good advice. And then any advice on the pay pig end, like if someone's wanting to be more submissive in a financial way, do they need a mentor, or is it more so just like, you know, assess your own boundaries and kind of have those in mind?
I think it's really important, if you're going to get into this, to vet a findom pretty appropriately. And what I mean by that is to ask for testimonials, ask for any kind
Okay.
of information that helps you feel a sense of safety. With
Okay.
regular BDSM that's not financially organized, we often will vet the Dom and make sure that that Dom comes with some safety credibility. So I think the same is true here. And same, when you're starting to do this research, you can tell who's doing really well.
Yeah.
And you can talk. Some findoms or some doms in general will have like communities that they engage with. And so there's open chat that you can talk to other folks who have paid and played with a findom. You can kind of get some feedback there. But I do think it's also really important to secure some safety precautions on your side. Maybe open a separate bank account if that's accessible to you, so that most of your funds are protected and there's no access there, but you have this separate place that maybe you can set up just for this kind of experience. And that gives
really
you some safeguards. One, you're not going to spend past your limits, but also it protects your identity a little bit more. So I think that's a really smart way to start. The other thing to do is to get more curious about what limits you want to set in terms of the finances that you want to spend, because it can be really exciting. And one of the biggest regrets I hear from the men that I work with in this space is I spent more than I wanted to, and now I'm financially in trouble. And it's easy to do, especially in this economy.
I can see that, right? I mean, it's fun, and maybe you're like, oh, I have the money, or it's fun when it hurts a little bit more or something. Almost more of that like emotional sadism or masochism rather. But it's like, I would encourage people to write it down too. It's like when it's almost like when you're sober, sexually sober, the hormones aren't taking over, to write it down. And then if you're having a moment, to be able to kind of refer back to that, like, okay, this is what my clear mind told me before I got into this altered, aroused state,
Completely. I agree. And that's one of the benefits of setting up a separate bank account or having one credit card that you use. You do have a clearer limit there, and you'll know when you reach it.
Well, this is a fascinating topic, and I appreciate you coming on and just kind of sharing more about what you know, because you know a lot about this. I'm impressed, it's cool. So and if people are curious, either about this or about just working with you in general, where can they find you?
Yeah, thank you. They can go to my website. It's probably the best place to start. It's modernintimacy.com. And I do have some articles on our blog about financial domination. Cool. And I'm happy to help consult with folks who are looking to inch into this space if that's something that feels exciting, but you don't know where to start.
Yeah, cool. And then we mentioned this at the beginning, but Dr. Kate is pretty active on TikTok and Instagram, so you can check her out there. And she's got her own podcast called Get Naked with Dr. Kate. So definitely go check that out and follow it. And thank you again so much for being here. And I look forward to, more chats and collaborations.
Likewise. This was so fun. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.